we had Dayan on Friday. He went through a bunch of these things with us. But let me reiterate, the deal had not been set yet, but the contours of it was certainly there, and the dynamics associated with this. From the perspective of people who follow these things, and I think Dayan put it this way in one of his pieces, and he certainly talked about it like this on Friday. Let's assume that there was no debt ceiling provision. It's dumb. It's stupid anyways. And Biden on day one should have just done the 14th Amendment because, I mean, let's face it, there's no reciprocal way in which the Republicans could strike back. They couldn't say, well, you know what we're going to do is we're going to outlaw guns because it says well-regulated militia in the Constitution. There's no opportunity for them to, you nuke the filibuster, we're going to nuke the filibuster. This wasn't one of those scenarios. But Washington is allergic to these kind of things. And there was some question, and I think this is also malarkey, but for the sake of being accurate, I have talked to some economists in those orbits who are like worried that if you kept issuing debt under the auspices of the 14th Amendment, it would go to the Supreme Court and people buying that debt, and it would be cheaper. It would have to be cheaper. People buying that debt would be worried about it. Or those loans, they'd be worried about it because they don't know the legal status of that debt. Essentially, like treasury bills. They don't know the legal status of stuff bought past the debt ceiling. Were you authorized to issue that debt? Now, that debt would be extremely low, supposedly, in terms of cost, because you get a risk, discount, essentially. Personally, I would take all the cash I would have. I would buy that. You give me a risk discount on U.S. Treasury bills, I'm sorry. I just don't think that the Supreme Court, Harlan Crow, is going to let Clarence Thomas, make us default on our debt. But who knows? If they saw it as an opportunity, the Republicans on the Supreme Court, as a way of like, this is the way that we tank Joe Biden's presidency and we get another Republican in office. I mean, remember, 3 of them were appointed by Donald Trump. It's not like they have bad feelings towards the guy.
Yeah, and all the stuff at the northern border and the southern border that they've been doing, like basically trying to derail any sort of post-COVID recovery, I think, pretty clearly.
Without a doubt. And so, to be fair, that's not inconceivable, not a crazy worry on their part, although I think I happen to think it's unfounded. All right. So with that said, if we lived in a country where there was no debt ceiling legislation, what would have happened is we would have already moved into a budget process. And because you have a Republican controlled House, they're going to have some say in this process. The only difference is that it probably wouldn't go anywhere. They wouldn't be able to pass a budget. You would get continuing resolutions for 2 years, and that would freeze everything. Now, a freeze on everything, even in times where we have low inflation, and now we have inflation around 4%, a little more, that's a cut. Because, if I freeze my kids' allowance from when they were 10 to the time that they're 15, the money's just not going to be worth the same. It's not going to be able to buy the same junk food that they bought before. In this instance, it means that both the expanding population and in some instances, changes in the population. There may be some agencies that deal with a older clientele. There's going to be cuts. That's essentially what we got here in this deal, except for the defense spending and veteran spending. Defense is going to get like another I don't know, 2024 raise. It's going to go up by something like $40 billion off the top of my head. It's a 3.3 increase over the current year. $886 billion for defense. Defense spending in 2015 was maybe 2/3 of that. It was $585 billion in 2015. It has gone up $300 billion. A big chunk by Trump. About half, a little more than half was Trump, and about half was Joe Biden. I mean, it is, and there's a great piece that Judd Legum had over at, I can't remember the name of his, what's the name? You can Google Judd Legum. I read it every day. I just can't remember the name. Popular Info. Is that what it is? And he basically, Popular Info, and he basically outlines the enormous sort of like sucking sound that you hear are defense contractors. Half of the budget is for defense contractors. This is a perfect example. He writes, in 1991, when there was genuine competition for military contracts, the cost of one shoulder fire Stinger missile was $25,000. Now, defense contractor Raytheon is the sole supplier. It's an antitrust issue, folks. Do you know how much there's a huge demand for these things because we're sending them to Ukraine. Do you know how much the cost of one missile is? 30 years ago, it was $25,000. Today, $400,000. I can't even do the math on that.
Yeah, I was just trying to think.
I can't even do the math on that. I mean, the cost of like renting an apartment in this city has probably doubled since then. I think in the early 90s, I got a studio apartment for $1,400 a month. And now I'd be surprised if you can find anything for less than, $2,500. And it was a nice apartment. It was in Manhattan. It was a nice apartment. I mean, it wasn't, it was small, but.
Double check this, but I think that's 32 times the.
That seems like a lot.
Yeah. They 32 times better missiles?
And, there's a little bit of inflation, but not that much inflation. So defense is getting this, is winning here. And I've seen one provision that I need to look into more about I think it was a pipeline that Joe Manchin wanted. Got snuck into the bill. Of course. He'll make some cash. Really, it's basically defense contractors and Joe Manchin are going to be making money off of this. This is the way that David Dayen characterizes it. Relative harm and help was kept to a minimum in the final agreement. In other words, there's nothing good in this. There's not a single thing good in this deal, except that the debt ceiling is raised, but that should have been done in 2022. Dayen writes, it will only be a little bit easier to commit wage theft if you're a corporation. It will only be a little bit easier to sell defective or poisoned products. It'll only be a little harder to get rental assistance or tuition support. Only a few people will be freer to pollute the environment. Only a few will find it more difficult to get food. The Internal Revenue Service will be only a little bit worse. A lot of things will stay the same. He says almost nothing will get any better. That's basically where we're at. The specifics, beyond that increase in military spending, is work requirements for TAMP, temporary assistance for needy families, and SNAP. The TAMP ones are optional. It's unclear to me. They're made, the work requirements are, and to be clear, we already have work requirements on SNAP. We already have work requirements on TAMP. This is all a function of Bill Clinton in 1996. 96, 94, 94, the Welfare Reform Act. And TAMP, I can't pronounce it, is going to be optional. So you're just going to see it in red states. They're just going to make it harder for needy families to get help. SNAP, there are two essentially work requirements. One limits able-bodied adults who have no children from getting benefits for more than 3 months over a 3-year period. So if you are an adult over the age of 21, you have no children, you are healthy and capable of work, regardless of whether you can find it or not, you get 3 months of food assistance every 3 years. That, the only sort of like cutoff to that was that if you were 21 to the age of 49. If you were over the age of 49, you could get SNAP assistance as you need it, assuming you're an able-bodied adult with no children. That age has now been increased to 54. It is, according to SNAP, it's going to cut their rolls by about 275,000 people per month. But also be clear, that's assuming that everyone from age 49 or 50 to 54 are aware of this change and get the letter, find the letter, and respond. In other words, there's going to be people who don't know, who are age 51 or 52 or 53, who have been on SNAP, and they're going to get cut off even though they're eligible. That's basically what's going to happen. It doesn't increase work, incidentally, these type of work requirements. We know this from Arkansas at the very least. We know theoretical, but Arkansas was a perfect, I mean, it was like, if you wanted to set up an experiment, you would go, you would have done what they did in Arkansas, and it didn't increase work at all. It just threw people off the rolls. It just made more people hungry. That's, incidentally, the goal. That is not a bug. That is the feature. A couple 100,000 people a month.
I mean, it says everything that we supposedly have this very, that both sides have to compromise, and we're getting serious about the deficit and the debt, and the solution is more money to defense contractors, and the rest of you work or starve.
Oh, yeah. Let's be clear. This doesn't impact the deficit or the debt. Not in any meaningful way. It's possible it grows it a little bit. Student debt. Biden administration had said that they were going to restart payments 60 days after the Supreme Court decision. This deal puts that promise in writing. And it will become legislation. I mean, I don't know if the Biden administration had been part of their strategy was to maintain that forbearance. They're not going to be able to do it now. If there's another emergency, they would be able to institute that forbearance again. We'll talk more about student debt another day. But understand what's going to happen. Millions of people are going to have to start repaying their student loans again. they were going to start that repayment process, I think, earlier this year, but because of the Supreme Court case, they put it off. Millions of people are going to have to do this, even if the Supreme Court okays the student debt program, relief program. If they don't, 45 million other people, like I think there was something like 10 million people who may have had all of their debt wiped out by the Biden announcement. So you're going to have the full 45 million. Everybody's going to be paying off their loans at that point. That's going to hurt the economy, obviously. The Biden administration apparently has been readying a new income-driven repayment system that will have everyone pay a percentage of their income. Those making $30,000 or less would pay nothing. This could be a big transformation on the student loan program, but we're going to see the Republicans come after that as well. And you got a couple of people in the Senate. We don't know where that's going to go. Biden would also veto it, but there's also something called administrative Paygo. It's unclear to me whether or not this is in the bill, although it could very well be. This was an executive order from George Bush. It was strengthened by Donald Trump. Anytime a federal agency proposes an action that would increase mandatory spending, it must also propose reducing mandatory spending by the same amount. So if that income-driven repayment system would increase the education department spending by reducing loan revenue, it would have to somehow take an action to offset that by an equivalent amount. This deal would make it statutory. And that would be horrible. That would be bad. So this deal is, it sucks. I don't know what else to tell you. Joe Biden can't negotiate for crap. Maybe he doesn't want to. I don't know why. He's certainly much more afraid of either some broad conventional wisdom or this notion that somehow bondholders would actually believe that there could be a real default, that somehow the Supreme Court would force us into default or something to that effect. If Joe Biden had an agenda like, I really want to cut 275,000 people off of SNAP each month of the 45 million people who are on it, it would be a very odd way of going about doing that if that was his agenda. This is it's just simply a lack of caring. We did pretty good based upon, how bad it could have been. And that's basically it. This is what the situation is. There's really nothing else to say about it. Today at noon, and it's probably happening right now. I'm sorry, at 3 p.m. today, noon West Coast, the House Rules Committee will meet and prepare the bill to be on the floor. There could be some intrigue here because there is a bunch of, because McCarthy had to put a bunch of, freedom lovers or whatever they call themselves these days, the Freedom Caucus, on that committee. They theoretically could sink the bill in committee, which would be hilarious. But supposedly unlikely that they're going to do that. Then at 6:30, the House votes on unrelated bills, and this gets everybody into the room, essentially into the Congress, and then everybody goes around and starts doing their whip count to see if there's enough votes to pass this bill. The Republicans meet tonight. Democrats meet tomorrow morning. to go over these whip counts, I guess, and debate the bill. Tomorrow night, the 72-hour review period will end, and they will try and vote by Wednesday morning, if not Thursday morning, if not tomorrow night. And then we'll see.
Do we have any indication how the progressives are voting?
I have not heard. I imagine they're going to go into caucus and they're going to find out how many votes that they need. And then some will be allowed to vote against and some will be allowed to vote for. Here's Kevin McCarthy.
The guy Biden lost to.
Guy that apparently even George Bush called a moron, which that's pretty impressive.
He'd know.
Here's Kevin McCarthy. Now, Kevin McCarthy's got to he's got to be completely obtuse about this because the Freedom Caucus expectations of what he should be getting much higher. But they also know they can't do anything. I mean, if the Freedom Caucus had any real cojones, they would say we're going after Medicare and Social Security, but they can't because Donald Trump told them they can't. So they love freedom a lot. But the bottom line is the mainstream Republican Party got what it wanted. Now, I know they are so anti-war, but apparently they combed the Defense Department, couldn't find a single wokeness. And so there was no cuts. But here is Kevin McCarthy, really word salad time so that nobody can figure out what is actually where he stands, how he knows he can't characterize the bill in one way or another because it's going to get him in trouble.
But we also did something different. In this family, we may have a child that able-bodied, not married, no kids, but he's sitting on the couch collecting welfare. We're going to put work requirements on that individual, so he's going to have work requirements. He's going to get a job, and it's going to make the life easier. But we're all
He's talking about the work requirements on
childless adults. He can't talk. Like McCarthy for a speaker, he can't speak. So he's saying we're going to put the individual. You can just take it one more time.
Well, yeah, take it one more time because it sounds like, I mean, what he's basically saying is that 50 to 54-year-olds, but he doesn't want to say that because everyone watching on Fox News is that age. Right. And so he doesn't want to trigger their lizard brain.
He makes it sound worse. I mean, it's awful, but yeah.
He made it sound actually worse, like he was actually sending kids to go work.
Yeah. I guess they got child labor on the brain over there.
Yeah.
But we also did something different. In this family, we may have a child that able-bodied, not married, no kids, but he's sitting on the couch collecting welfare. We're going to put work requirements on that individual, so he's going to have work requirements. He's going to get a job, and it's going to make the life easier. But we're all
So I guess when he's talking about family, is he's talking about your grandfather might be there.
I think.
Can you go back earlier? Do we have
no,
it?
That's it. That's it. But I think when he says child, he means to say childless adults. And
if he's talking within a family, it's got to be maybe your uncle is there or something like that. Or your grandfather. I don't know. We should say there was one upside. And I forgot to mention this. All work requirements for homeless people and veterans are gone. So you're probably offsetting, and it's unclear how many, but you're probably offsetting, probably going to keep the SNAP rolls more or less the same, but you are throwing some people off. But you're allowing homeless people. Now, how many homeless people are going to read about this deal or, but hopefully there'll be community outreach groups that are able to sort of say, here's an opportunity for you to eat. Let's SNAP. Same with veterans. I mean, the way that communities of people like this are, brought into the system is by outreach groups, NGOs, essentially. that are out there, will find people and bring them to the services that they have. So that's the deal. It does not appear that any of these conservative caucus people are aiming to unseat McCarthy because, and that's what we were told, right? If he comes to a deal with Biden, he's going to lose his seat. It doesn't appear so because the dirty little secret is there was never a position by the Republican Party. Remember, they don't even, and understand this too. These are top line numbers. You get a certain budget, and where that money goes in between like different agencies or different projects, that goes through an appropriation process. And that's the way that the budget is made. If they can't go through that, then we may actually end up seeing ultimately a continuing resolution on this stuff. Which the benefit of which would be it would freeze the defense stuff. But I need to read more into that. But the point being, the Republicans came to this negotiation without really a position. It's as if you were going into, if you were a union and you were going into negotiate with management, and 25% of your union said strike, 25% of your union said don't strike, another 25% said maybe we'll strike, but we want there to be lights in the workshop. And another 25% said, we probably won't strike, but what we really want is 15 minutes longer for lunch. That was a weakness that theoretically was why this deal became such just a mild, relative for them, a mild discomfort, as opposed to a complete disaster. The fact that there were negotiations at all, in my estimation, was a disaster.